Yes, Ukraine and Russia are now 2 months into a war that many analysts initially thought would be over in days. Russia's military has struggled to make progress against the highly motivated Ukrainian defenders amid multiple horrific reports of possible mass graves and possible war crimes. How long can Europe maintain a united front as millions of Ukrainians flee to neighboring countries? And joining us now to help assess where things stand are Ian Kelly, the ambassador in residence at Northwestern University. Kelly formerly served as U.S. ambassador to Georgia, and prior to that, he was ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And Jessica Darrow, professor at the University of Chicago School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice, where her research focuses on refugee resettlement issues. Welcome both of you to Chicago tonight. Ambassador Kelly, I'll start with you. Now more than 2 months into this battle that analysts thought might be over in days or weeks, how do you assess where it stands right now?
Well, I think it's been absolutely extraordinary how motivated, as you say, the Ukrainian armed forces and territorial defense forces are in trying to repel the Russians. The Russians got a real bloody nose in the north and were forced to withdraw. I think that we are looking at a second phase of the war now. I think Putin has kind of dialed back his war goals, no longer talking about taking out the government. Now they're just talking about focusing on what they call vulnerable Russians in the Donbass, in the eastern region of Ukraine.
Could that second phase, though, include an escalation in the type of weapons and warfare used in that eastern region?
Well, it'll be a different kind of battle there, I think. The terrain in the north was very different. It was marshy and forested. It wasn't a good place for armor. The eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbass region, on the other hand, is very suited for armor. It is very flat and is not as wooded as the area around Kiev.
And Jessica Darrow, there are reports now that more than 11 million Ukrainians have fled their homeland, a little less than half of that to neighboring countries. How equipped are EU countries at handling that volume of refugees?
Well, I think we've seen some pretty important shifts in the policy of the European Union in response to the scale and scope of this crisis. Pretty quick and efficient shifts. So they've introduced for the first time temporary protected status that's very similar to the one we have here in the US. And this allows for, we hope, a bit of diffusion, if you will, of the number of people that you might find in directly neighboring EU states. People can move further into the EU and access the kinds of services and benefits that they might need to support their families until they can return, hopefully, to Ukraine.
And President Biden has committed to accepting 100,000 Ukrainian refugees. But to put that in context, the country of Poland alone has accepted 2.8 million, roughly the population of Chicago. So is the United States quota going to be enough here to make a difference?
Well, I think there are a couple important distinctions to make there. Obviously, coming to the U.S. is very different than crossing a border and directly into Poland. The refugee process is not necessarily the most efficient or speedy way for people to access safety. The process for receiving refugee status takes some time, and security clearance into the U.S. also takes quite a bit of time. It's a very, very thorough process. So it does make sense that the numbers would be drastically different in the two different places. That said, I do think that the Biden administration is doing something very important in signifying to the rest of the world that the U.S. is on board in many ways, but including by welcoming and accepting at least 100,000 refugees to date, is the current number, as you say. That will also encourage other refugee resettlement states to make those same sorts of commitments on par with their own capacity, we hope.
And Ambassador Kelly, President Biden today again committed to providing more military aid and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, $800 million in the latest round of military aid. What types of weapons programs will that fund, and how impactful could that be?
Well, I think, it's really very much what the Ukrainians need in this phase two of the war, in which I think that armor, the tanks and armored personnel carriers will be used a lot more. They're going to see there's a need for more traditional weapons, and so a big part of this package was artillery. It was the biggest the biggest package of howitzers and corresponding ammunition that we have provided. And this is in response to what the Ukrainians want. They want to be able to resist a more traditional ground war in the flatlands of eastern Ukraine.
Could a byproduct of this, Ambassador Kelly, be that Putin escalates this conflict beyond Ukraine, as Kremlin officials have threatened, as the United States and other EU countries have continued to supply weapons here?
Well, I think this is precisely the reason why the U.S. and Europe are really all in providing Ukraine with the kind of weapons they need to repel this kind of invasion. We cannot let Putin succeed. If he succeeds here, as he succeeded in Georgia, and as he succeeded in Syria without any kind of cost being imposed on him, he might start looking elsewhere. And so that's why it's so important that we help Ukraine to the maximum extent possible.
And Jessica Darrow, I mean, a lot has been said about the unity of EU nations and the United States. This acceptance of refugees, millions and millions of refugees, will this continue to hold if this conflict drags out for months or even years and we see millions of more refugees pour in to these countries?
Well, I think it's another key question. There's several answers to it, all of which I think are worth pursuing. But in the interest of time, I'll just name a couple key features that I think about. One is the status of the labor market. The fact is a lot of the European Union is facing a labor shortage. And so having folks who are interested maybe not in staying in the long term, but in finding a livelihood in the short term until they can return to their own country, most Ukrainians will probably want to go home. I think that might be received with some welcome in the industries and the areas where there is a labor shortage. I think you point, unfortunately, to a larger dynamic that we've seen. We can just look to history to know that if folks have resource shortages of any kind, and then there's a greater demand on those shortages, resentment can build. I think another feature that's very important here is race and ethnicity and religion. And we have certainly seen here in the US a recent welcome for Afghan refugees, but in our not so distant past, we've been rather unwelcoming to refugees, specifically from Muslim nations. So I think it's also important to think about what kind of welcome refugees from Europe, who are understood to be or are perceived as white, that might receive a different sort of a welcome. And I think we have to push back on that narrative. I think we have to be a little bit more thoughtful about what inclusivity means over time. And that's going to take a lot of framing and a lot of work on the behalf, I believe, of refugee advocates and advocates for any sort of a welcoming community.
And part of the work that you're doing. All right, we'll have to leave it there. Our thanks to Ambassador Ian Kelly and Professor Jessica Darrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.